My name is Rachel Whittaker, and at 35, I finally owned something that was mine and mine alone. A little cottage right on the California coast. 2 bedrooms, a gutter that dripped when it rained, and more silence than I'd had in 11 years. My very first night in it, the phone rang. It was my mother. She skipped hello completely. She just said, "We're moving in tomorrow. Your father already agreed." I stood there in my own kitchen and stopped breathing for a second. Then she tacked on the line she always uses. "If you have a problem with it, you can go live somewhere else." My hands were trembling, but I found myself grinning because she'd made one slip that night and she had no idea. By the time that rented truck came grinding up my drive the next morning, I'd made 3 phone calls, and I'd invited the exact people my mother would have paid money to keep out of that room. Welcome to the channel, where regular women quit apologizing and start telling the truth out loud. If your family has always taken more from you than it ever gave back, you belong here. Leave a comment, tap subscribe, and stick around. What happened when that truck showed up is something I'll carry for the rest of my life. For 11 years, I worked the emergency room at a hospital outside Sacramento. Overnight shifts, mostly. I trained myself to step into the worst hour of a total stranger's life and keep my tone flat and steady. Nurses don't fall apart. We sort. We hunt down whatever's bleeding hardest, and we shut that down first. I was good at the job. I was good at it for so many years that I never noticed I'd slowly started vanishing. On my last shift, a patient flatlined twice before dawn, and both times we dragged him back. When the day nurse showed up at 7 to take over, it hit me that I had no memory of the drive in. I'd spent a whole decade keeping other people breathing, and somewhere along the way I'd forgotten to keep myself alive too. So I walked away. No big speech, no scene. I signed the paperwork, handed back my badge, and pulled out of the lot in the flat gray morning. Friends asked if the change terrified me. It didn't. I had a plan and a number sitting in my savings account that I'd stacked up one 12-hour shift at a time. I sold my city condo, the one with a gym I never touched and a window that stared at a parking garage. I took that money plus everything I'd saved, and I bought a cottage on the water, 250 miles away from every single person who knew my name. It was tiny and old and completely mine. There was exactly one name printed on the deed. Mine. Hold on to that fact, because in about 24 hours my mother was going to pretend it didn't exist on purpose, and she was going to do it with a crowd watching. That first afternoon, though, I didn't know any of what was coming. All I knew was that the air smelled like salt water, and for the first time in ages, not one soul needed me to patch anything up. You have to understand what kind of daughter I'd always been, because it explains why my mother felt so certain she'd win. In our family, I was the one who dealt with everything. When my brother Brandon bounced a rent payment at 26, I quietly covered it. When my parents got into it over the holidays, I was the one steering my dad out to the garage to cool down. When Grandma Alice got sick, I drove 3 hours every weekend for a year and slept sitting up in a recliner beside her bed. Nobody ever actually asked me to. That was the whole trick. In our house, Rachel will take care of it was never a question. It was more like a weather report. My mother, Diane, would say it the way people say it looks like rain later. And I let her get away with it for 35 years because turning her down felt like leaving a cut wide open. A nurse's hands hate an open wound. They want to close it, wrap it, make the hurting stop. That reflex was a gift to strangers. It was an even bigger gift to my family, and it cost me more than I ever bothered to tally. I'm not telling you this so you'll pity me. I'm telling you so you can see the math running through my mother's head that night. She wasn't requesting permission to move into my home. She had never in her life needed my permission for a single thing. She'd spent 3 decades watching me swallow whatever the family dropped on my plate, and she had every reason on earth to expect I'd swallow this one too. A free house on the beach. Naturally, Rachel would handle it. That was the forecast. What she failed to factor in was that I'd finally landed somewhere with no one left to rescue. And an empty calendar does something dangerous to a woman. It hands her time to actually think. Roughly 10 weeks before that first night, I'd made a choice that ended up mattering way more than I realized. I went silent, not furious, silent, on a professional's advice. The same week I left the hospital, a therapist I'd seen a grand total of 2 times said something plain that stuck. She told me you can't heal in the same room where you got wounded. My family was that room, so I muted the group chats. I quit picking up calls during shifts that no longer existed. When my mother texted, "Give me a ring when you can," I let a couple days slide by before I did, and somehow the earth kept spinning. I wasn't trying to punish anybody. I was just a patient finally swallowing her own medicine. For 2 months, I let myself do nothing but recover. Long walks, whole nights of sleep, the slow project of figuring out who I even was when nobody was paging me. I hadn't felt that healthy since nursing school. But here's the catch with going quiet. The room keeps on talking after you've left it. I hadn't figured that part out yet. I honestly believed silence was a wall I'd put up around myself, a clean, healthy boundary. What I didn't grasp was that on the far side of that wall, a story about me was getting told to people I loved. In rooms I wasn't standing in, and the longer I kept still, the more that story cooled and set into something everyone treated as fact. My mother had 10 weeks and a trapped audience. She squeezed everything out of both. While I was quietly gluing myself back together, she was telling her sister, her church crowd, and half my cousins that her daughter had finally seen the light. That her daughter wanted to look after her aging parents. That her daughter had offered. I had offered absolutely nothing. But you can't fight a story you've never even heard, and I was about to hear the entire thing all at once. Let me tell you about the cottage, because it's the only character in this whole mess that never once lied to me. It sat at the tail end of a sandy little lane, close enough to the surf that I could hear it from bed. The porch boards had gone silver after 45 years of salt and weather. The kitchen had these yellow cabinets some past owner had painted by hand, a touch crooked, and I loved them more than anything I'd ever bought. There was a wicker chair on the porch that came with the place. I'd had the keys for about a month, but between wrapping up the condo and 100 tiny errands, I'd only lugged the last of my boxes down that morning. This was my first genuine afternoon there. I dropped into that wicker chair with a mug of coffee, watched the light go orange over the water, and fell dead asleep sitting straight up. When I came to, the coffee had gone cold and the sky had turned purple. And I hadn't dreamed about a patient or a monitor or a code. I just slept. Do you have any idea how long it had been since I rested without earning it first? I couldn't even remember. I sat there in the dark a while longer, listening to the waves, and I thought, this is the thing I was working toward. Not something to show off. Something to just breathe in. I'd never once had a space that belonged only to me. As a kid, my bedroom doubled as storage for Brandon's hockey gear. My first apartment I shared. My condo I bought during a stretch so brutal I barely lived inside it. This cottage was the first patch of ground that didn't want a single thing from me. It just held me up. I remember thinking I ought to call somebody and tell them I was happy. I'm relieved I didn't because the phone rang on its own a few minutes later and the voice on the other end had zero interest in my happiness. It wanted the house. The screen said Mom. I answered the way I always did, gentle and already braced to help. Hey, Mom. No greeting back. She launched right in. We're moving in tomorrow, she said. Your father says it's fine. I actually laughed, sure I'd misheard her. Moving in where? I asked. The beach house, she said, like I was a little slow. We'll be down by noon. Brandon's picking up the truck. I grabbed the edge of my own yellow counter. Mom, this is my house. I bought it. I live here now. There was a beat, and then her voice went flat and cheerful at the exact same time, that tone she pulls out when she's already decided something and finds it irritating that you're still speaking. Rachel, we're family. Family looks after family. I told her carefully that we'd never talked about this, that nobody had run it by me. And that's when she said the words I'll be hearing in my sleep until the day I die. If you don't like it, you can go find somewhere else. Find somewhere else. From my own mother. About the house I'd paid for with 11 years of overnight shifts. I didn't shout. I need you to know that. Something inside me went very quiet and very sharp, the same way it used to right before a trauma case came rolling through the doors. She kept going, telling me which bedroom she wanted, saying Dad needed the one with the morning sun. She said we so many times I lost the count. And not one single time did she ask a question. Not would that work for you? Not could we. Just we, rolling into my life like the tide coming in. And underneath all of it sat that one line that didn't belong. Your father says it's fine, Dad. My quiet, conflict-hating father had somehow signed off on taking my house. I told her I'd call her back. Then I sat down to think. Here's the part I'm least proud of, and probably the part that's going to sound painfully familiar to a lot of you. My first gut reaction wasn't to fight it. It was to fix it. My thumb was already drifting toward her name to call back and smooth the whole thing over. I caught myself writing the words in my head. Maybe just for a short while. Maybe the back bedroom. Maybe I could make this work somehow, keep the peace, be the daughter who handles things. 35 years of reflex all going off at once, whispering that the quickest way out of this ache was to just hand them what they wanted. I sat there with my cold coffee, watched my own hand shake, and I made myself stop. Triage first, I told myself. You don't treat a wound you haven't even looked at yet. That was the rule that saved more lives than any medication I ever pushed. Look before you move. Find out what's actually bleeding. So I laid the phone face down and I started asking myself the real questions, the same way I'd size up a patient I couldn't read. Why now? Why is she this sure? Why your father says it's fine, when my dad had never made a bold call like that in his entire life? Why was there a truck already rented on a single day's notice, when normal people book those a week ahead? None of it read like a spur-of-the-moment idea. It read like a plan, one that had been rolling forward for a while without me in the loop. And the longer I chewed on it, one detail bugged me above all the rest. Brandon was renting the truck. My broke, recently divorced brother, who hadn't held down a job in a year, was suddenly the moving coordinator hauling our parents 250 miles. I picked the phone back up. I called him. Brandon answered on the fourth ring, and I could hear a TV going in the background, which meant he was down in our parents' basement where he'd been crashing since the divorce. Rachel, he said, way too quickly. Look, before you start, I'm not starting anything, I told him. I've just got a question. Mom says you're renting a truck. A pause. Yeah, for the move. What move, Brandon? A longer pause, and I could practically hear him working out how much he could afford to admit. Don't make this weird, he finally said. Everybody already knows. It's been the plan for weeks. Everybody already knows. I kept my voice as smooth as I'd keep it with a scared patient. Knows what exactly? That you're moving Mom and Dad in? To the beach, he said, and there was something defensive coiling under his words. Everybody's relieved, honestly. It's been a lot around here. I asked him who everybody was. He rattled them off like a shopping list. Aunt Carol, 2 of our cousins, the Prestons from church. Mom told all of them, I said. Mom didn't tell them anything, Brandon shot back. You offered, remember? I had not offered. I hadn't so much as hinted at it. But I didn't bother saying that to Brandon because I could hear in his voice that he believed it, or he'd decided to believe it because believing it fixed a problem for him too. If Mom and Dad moved to the coast, that basement went back to being his. I told him I had to go. Rachel, he said, just be cool about this, okay? I hung up before I had to answer. I sat in my dark kitchen with the water hushing outside the window, and one cold, clean fact clicked into place. There was a story going around about me, and I was the very last person on the planet to hear it. I didn't have to wait long for backup on that. My phone lit up while it was still in my hand. Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, who has literally never called me unless she'd been sent, I answered. There she is, Carol sang out. Honey, we are all just so proud of you. I asked what she was proud of, keeping it light. Stepping up like this, she said, warm as anything. Taking your folks in. Lord knows it's a big thing to ask, but family takes care of family, and you've always had the biggest heart of anybody. Family takes care of family. There it was again, the exact phrase my mother used, handed down the line like a covered dish at a potluck. I asked Carol gently when exactly it was that I'd offered to take my parents in. She laughed like I'd cracked a joke. "Oh, your mother told us months back. Said the two of you had it all figured out. Said you wanted them close so you could keep an eye on them." Months back. I'd closed on this house 4 weeks earlier and moved in that very afternoon. The closing papers were still sitting in a folder on my counter. I asked Carol one last thing, the way I'd ask a patient to describe a symptom without setting off alarm bells. "Did Mom say I offered or that she asked me?" There was a small silence on the line, the first crack. "Well," Carol said slowly, "she said you offered, that's what she told us." I told her I appreciated the call. I told her I loved her. Both were true. Then I sat perfectly still and finally understood what I was up against. This wasn't a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding is two people remembering the same conversation two different ways. This was a campaign. My mother had taken something that never happened and carried it door to door until it hardened into fact in everyone's mouth but mine. And I had one day to pull it apart. The odd thing was that I wasn't even shocked. The longer I sat with it, the more I recognized the shape of the whole thing. My mother had been running this exact move my entire life. She just never played it for stakes this size. She never asked. She announced, and then she let the crowd do her pushing for her. When she wanted my college graduation party at her house instead of a restaurant, she didn't ask me. She told the relatives it was at her place, mailed the invitations, and by the time I heard a word about it, saying no would have meant crushing 40 people who'd already bought presents. When she wanted me to co-sign Brandon's car loan, she didn't ask. She told him it was handled, told him to go pick out the car, and slid the paperwork in front of me with my brother sitting there beside her, hopeful. Saying no in that moment meant breaking his heart to his face. She built rooms full of expectation, then stood me in the doorway of each one and dared me to walk out and play the villain. It worked every single time, because I cared more about not hurting people than I cared about not being used. That was my whole life summed up in one line. And I'd never seen it spelled out so clearly until I was sitting alone in a cottage 250 miles away, finally standing outside the crowd. And that's when the plan started coming together, even though I didn't have all the pieces yet. If my mother's only real weapon was the crowd, the shame of turning her down in front of everyone, then the crowd was also the one place she could lose. She'd built her story in front of an audience. I'd take it apart in front of that same audience. But first, I needed to know how far it had already spread. So I called my father. He picked up on the second ring and said my name like a man who'd spent the whole day dreading it. "Rachel." Just that. "Dad," I said. "Mom says you told her it's fine moving into my house." I heard him let out a breath. My father isn't a cruel man, he's a tired one. A man who spent 40 years letting my mother make the loud calls so he'd never have to make any himself. "Your mother has a plan," he said quietly. "Dad, that's not an answer." "We're in a tight spot, honey," he said, and his voice cracked right on the word tight. Things didn't go the way I figured they would. I asked him what things. And slowly, in that careful, embarrassed way men of his generation talk about money, it came out in pieces. The business he'd sunk his retirement into hadn't worked. There'd been a partner and a loan, and then there hadn't been a business at all. "How bad, Dad?" I asked. He didn't answer that straight. What he said instead was worse. "Your mother handles the house stuff," he said. "I don't ask, I just sign wherever she points." And there it was, the full truth of my father in one sentence. He hadn't said it's fine because he'd thought about my house at all. He'd said it's fine because he'd quit looking at what he was signing years ago. I felt the anger rise up, and I let it move through me the way I let everything move through me on a hard shift. Not gone, just managed. "Dad," I said, "did Mom tell you I offered the house?" A long pause. "She said the two of you worked it out." "We didn't," I said. He went silent. Then, almost too soft to catch, he said, "Oh, just oh," like a little light had flickered on in a room he'd deliberately kept dark. We hung up, and I went to find the folder. Before I tell you what was inside that folder, I have to be straight about the moment that hit first, because it's a moment a lot of you will feel right in your gut. After I got off the phone with my dad, the fixer in me came charging back full force. They're broke, I thought. Dad's humiliated. They've got nowhere to land. You've got a whole second bedroom sitting empty. What kind of daughter leaves her elderly parents swinging in the wind over a little pride? I sat there and I genuinely talked myself almost all the way to yes. I opened a text to my mother. I typed, "Okay, we need to lay out some ground rules, but okay." My thumb hovered over send. And I want you to understand something. That text wasn't kindness. I've spent enough years around real kindness to know the difference. That text was the old wound trying to slam itself shut the fast way, the way that heals crooked and aches all winter for the rest of your life. Saying yes wouldn't have saved my parents. It would have rewarded a lie, proven to my mother that the campaign worked, and handed Brandon a beach house to start circling. It would have meant that the first thing I ever owned by myself became, inside of a day, just one more thing the family used up. The water hushed outside. I made myself read that text one more time. Then I deleted it word by word until the box was empty. My hand had almost stopped shaking. And right then, before I could even feel good about myself, the phone buzzed in my palm with a notification I hadn't seen in 2 months. A group chat blowing up. The name at the top read, in a cheery little font, Whittaker Family. 37 unread messages. I'd muted it back when I went quiet. I unmuted it and I started reading. But before I scrolled, I did the thing 11 years of nursing had beaten into me. I gathered my chart. You don't walk into a hard conversation with a family without your facts lined up, and I wasn't about to walk into mine unprepared. I went to the kitchen drawer where I'd stuck the closing folder 4 weeks earlier, the day I got the keys. Plain manila, already going a little soft at the corners. I opened it flat on the yellow counter under the one good light. The deed sat on top. I'd read it before, of course, at the closing, while a kind real estate attorney named Ms. Delgado walked me through every page. But I read it again now, slowly, the way you read a lab result that's about to decide your next move. Grantee, one name. Rachel Ann Whittaker, not and, not or. Not my mother, not my father, not Brandon, not the Whittaker family. One name, mine, filed with the county. I sat with that single line for a while and something settled in me that no amount of guilt could budge. The cottage wasn't a feeling. It wasn't a favor I owed or a kindness somebody could shame out of me. It was a legal fact with my name on it, recorded in a courthouse, and no story told at a church potluck could rewrite one word of it. I remembered Ms. Delgado's card, paperclipped inside the folder. I set it aside where I could grab it. Then I propped the deed against the backsplash so I could see it, took a breath, and picked the phone back up. The family chat was still glowing. 37 messages. I scrolled all the way to the top, to where the whole thing started, and I began reading what my family had been saying about me while I had the world on mute. The first message that mattered came from my mother, dated 3 weeks back. "Big news, everyone," it read. "Rachel has finally agreed to do right by us. We'll be moving down to her place on the water this fall." Underneath it, a string of hearts and praying hands from aunts and cousins. "So happy for you all, what a blessing." Rachel always was the responsible one. I scrolled down, my coffee long forgot. My mother had posted again a week later with a photo of my cottage. My cottage. The silver porch. The crooked yellow cabinets showing through the window. The caption read, "Our new place on the water, can't wait." Our new place. She'd pulled that photo from the listing I'd sent to exactly one person, my father, in a proud moment. There were messages about which church she'd already picked out down here. A message asking whether there'd be room for Brandon too, just until he gets on his feet. A message from Aunt Carol. Rachel is such a good girl to take all this on. And then, near the bottom, the one that tilted the floor under me. My cousin Megan had posted a screenshot. It was a real estate listing. My parents' house. The brick ranch I grew up in, the one with my height marked in pencil on the laundry room door frame. And stamped across the photo in red letters was a single word, under contract. The message below it read, "Congrats Aunt Diane and Uncle Gary on the sale, onward to the beach." I read it 3 times. They hadn't just decided to move in with me. They had sold their house, signed a contract, set a closing date. They had cut the rope behind them and were standing at the edge of a cliff that was my front door, betting everything they owned that I would never let them fall. My mother hadn't asked me for a home. She'd told the entire family I'd already given them one, sold the only one they had, and left me exactly one acceptable answer. Yes, I put the phone down. My hands were completely still now. I sat with it for a long time, and I let myself feel the whole shape of the thing before I decided anything. This was not a frightened old couple with nowhere to go. That was the story I'd nearly rescued an hour earlier, the story that almost handed my parents a key to my front door. This was something colder and more calculated. My mother had looked at my healing, my hard-won quiet, the one thing I'd ever built for myself, and she'd seen real estate. She'd seen a way to solve her problem using my future. And she'd seen it so clearly that she'd sold her own house on the strength of a yes I never gave. She didn't ask me to share my home. She told everyone I already had. And then she made it true the only way she could, by making any other answer unthinkable. If I said no now, I wasn't turning down a request. In the story she'd built, I was throwing my homeless parents out on the street out of pure selfishness. That was the headline all 37 messages had already agreed on. And for one more minute, the old fear had its hand around my throat. Then it let go, and it didn't come back because I finally understood the rules of the game I'd been losing my whole life. My mother's only weapon was the audience. The shame only worked because that audience believed her version and never once heard mine. She'd spent 3 weeks loading that weapon. But a weapon like that has a flaw. It points both directions. Every single person she'd told a lie to was a person who could hear the truth. She'd gathered my jury for me. All I had to do was call them into the same room at the same hour and quit being quiet. And I knew exactly what hour that would be. Noon tomorrow when the truck rolled in. I want to stop here a second because I know some of you are sitting with that exact knot in your stomach right now. The one that says if you say no, you become the bad guy. I felt it inside a house I'd paid for with 11 years of my own work. If anyone has ever convinced you that your boundary was an insult, stay with me for what comes next. Tap subscribe and let's keep going because this is where it turned. Something shifted in me once I set that phone down. For 35 years, every time my family tugged at me, I'd asked myself the same thing. Am I being selfish? That's a good question for a child. It's a trap for an adult. That night, sitting under my crooked yellow cabinets, I quit asking it. I asked a different one instead, one I'd never let myself say out loud. What do I want tomorrow to look like? And the answer came so fast and so calm that I nearly laughed. I wanted the truth in the room, all of it. Before I built anything, I made sure the ground under it was solid, because a nurse doesn't hang a treatment on a guess. I thought back to the closing, to Ms. Delgado explaining things I'd half tuned out because they felt like somebody else's problems. She'd said the deed was titled in my name alone. Sole ownership. Recorded with the county. She'd said that meant the house was mine to do with as I pleased, full stop. I remembered asking her, half joking, whether my mother could ever cause trouble over it, because some part of me always braces for that. Ms. Delgado had smiled and said the thing I now gripped like a handrail. A promise made at a dinner table isn't a deed. In her words, a verbal agreement to give someone property doesn't transfer a thing. The law wants it written, signed, recorded. My mother could tell every relative in 3 states that I'd offered her the house. She could believe it herself. It would carry the exact same legal weight as a wish. The only document that meant anything was leaning against my backsplash with one name on it. I won't pretend the law was the whole fight. The law doesn't keep a moving truck from pulling into your driveway. It doesn't stop your mother from crying in front of your aunts and calling you heartless. But it meant that when the noise came, I'd be standing on stone instead of sand. They couldn't force me to let them in. They couldn't stay if I told them to go. Everything past that point was just my mother's favorite weapon. The crowd, the shame, the show. And I'd finally worked out how to turn it back around on her. I picked up Ms. Delgado's card. It was pushing 9 at night, but lawyers have email and I had a long night ahead of me. I emailed her a little after 9. I kept it short and factual, the way I'd write a handoff note between shifts. I told her my parents planned to move into the property the next day, that they believed they had a right to, and that I wanted to know exactly where I stood and whether I needed anything in writing. I figured I wouldn't hear back until morning. She replied in 40 minutes, which told me she'd seen this kind of thing plenty of times before. Her answer was calm and clear, and I read it twice. She confirmed what I remembered. The property was mine alone. No one else held any legal interest in it. A verbal claim, no matter who made it or how many people they'd told, transferred nothing. She wrote that I was under no obligation to let anyone move in, and that anyone who came inside and refused to leave would be there without my permission, which is a situation the law has very plain words for. Then she offered something I hadn't even asked for but was glad to take. She said, if it would help, she could put the essentials in a short letter on her firm's letterhead confirming my sole ownership, something I could keep on hand. Sometimes, she wrote, people will argue with a daughter, but they won't argue with a lawyer. I wrote back, yes, please, and thank you. By 10:30, there was a one-page PDF in my inbox. My name, the parcel number, the recording date, and 2 dry sentences confirming that the home belonged to me and that no other party held any claim. I printed it on the little printer in my new spare room. I slid it into the manila folder, right behind the deed. 2 pages now. One from a courthouse, one from a lawyer. Quiet pages. The loudest things in the whole house. The next line on my list said, confirm the locks, and I almost laughed when I crossed it off, because there was nothing left to do. I'd already handled it without realizing I was protecting myself. When you buy a house, any decent person at the closing tells you to change the locks, because you never know how many keys from the last owner are floating around out there. Ms. Delgado had told me exactly that 4 weeks earlier, and I'd done it the same afternoon I got the keys, long before I carried a single box inside. A locksmith came out and rekeyed the front door, the back door, and the side door off the kitchen. He handed me 3 shiny keys on a ring, and those were the only keys to my house that existed anywhere in the world. My mother didn't have one. My father didn't have one. Brandon, who I'd later find out had been talking like he'd be settling into the spare room, didn't have one either. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters. I wasn't locking my family out. You can't lock someone out of a door you never handed them a key to. From the day the house became mine, I'd simply treated it like it was mine, because it was. The locks weren't some weapon I forged for the war ahead. They were just the ordinary good sense of a woman who'd finally bought something and fully intended to keep it. I stood at my front door that night and turned the deadbolt, felt it slide home solid and clean, and I thought about all the times in my life I'd left a door unlocked for people who walked right through and rearranged my furniture. Not this one. I switched off the kitchen light. I had one phone call left to make in the morning, and it was the important one. The way I saw it, the plan barely counted as a plan, and that was exactly why I trusted it. Complicated schemes are the ones built on getting even. This wasn't about getting even. It was more like a dressing change on a shift. You clean the wound, you let the air hit it, you let it close honestly instead of rotting under a bandage made of polite little lies. My mother had built her entire position in front of people who only ever heard her half of it. So I'd do the plainest thing possible. I'd get those same people into one room at one time, put the paperwork on the table, and let them watch her try to argue with a document. No shouting. No accusations she could twist into proof that I was falling apart. Just the facts sitting out in the open, while the folks she'd fed the story to watched her run into a wall. And the best part was that I didn't have to trick anybody into coming. The truth was the invitation. I'd ring up my aunt and my cousins, tell them how thrilled I was that they were happy for us, and ask if they'd like to swing by for a little housewarming the morning my parents got to town. Of course they'd say yes. They believed they were driving down for a happy ending. They were driving down for the truth, which is a different animal, and sometimes a kinder one. I called Aunt Carol at 8 the next morning. Early enough to catch her before the day carried her off, late enough that it wouldn't seem odd. I made my voice warm, and I didn't have to work at it because I do love her. And because the kindest thing I could do for her right then was stop letting my mother aim her at me like a tool. I told her how glad I was that everyone was so excited about the move. She said they surely were. Then I mentioned that Mom and Dad were rolling in around noon, and asked whether she and Megan and Lauren might want to come too. Make it a proper little housewarming. Let the family see the place. There was a pause on the line, a happy one. She said they'd love that and then, almost checking herself, asked if I was sure on moving day of all days. I told her I was sure that it mattered to me for everyone to be there. That last part was the truest thing I said all morning, even though Carol heard it one way and I meant it another. She got right to planning what she'd bring. A coffee cake, maybe some of her good folding chairs stacked in the back of the van. I let her. I told her noon, and to come a little early if she could swing it. She promised to round up the cousins. When I hung up, I sat still for a second and felt how strange the whole thing was. I just invited my mother's own witnesses to watch her story fall apart, and they'd thanked me for the invitation, and they were bringing dessert. I wouldn't call what I felt pride, exactly. It was closer to the feeling you get after you finally set a broken bone the right way. A hard, clean ache, and underneath it, relief. I brewed a full pot of coffee. I set out more mugs than I'd need. I put the manila folder back in the kitchen drawer, closed but not buried. Then I carried my coffee out to the wicker chair on the silver porch, and I sat there in the morning light, waiting for my family to arrive. People who have heard this story tend to ask me the same thing. Why didn't I just call my mother back and let her have it, scream until my throat gave out? Here's what 11 years of trauma work taught me. The loudest person in a room is almost never the one running it. I didn't need volume, I needed witnesses. If you've ever learned the hard way that the calmest person in the room usually holds the most power, then you already know how that morning was going to go. I should tell you that I slept the night before. Really slept, deep and dreamless, in the back bedroom with the window cracked so the water could come through. On the morning of the hardest conversation of my life, I woke up rested. That's how I knew the fight was already finished somewhere that counted. The rest was just waiting for everyone else to catch up. Carol and the cousins pulled in at 11:40, a solid 20 minutes ahead of noon, exactly the way I'd hoped. Carol came up the porch steps with a foil-wrapped coffee cake balanced on her good folding chairs, and Megan and Lauren trailed behind her with a thermos and a mesh bag of little oranges, acting like they'd shown up for the family reunion they thought this was. Carol looked out at the water and said it was a little slice of heaven, and she wasn't wrong. I'd thought the same thing sitting in that chair the night before all of this started. I poured them coffee in my mismatched mugs and let them roam the small rooms. They gushed over the crooked yellow cabinets and the weathered porch and the cracked window with the sea breeze pouring in. Lauren asked which bedroom would be mine and which would be Mom's, and I just smiled and told her the coffee was fresh. I never lied to them. I want that on the record. Not once did I repeat the words my mother had stuffed into my mouth. I simply let them stand in my house in the sun, warm and full of oranges, and let them be exactly as happy to be there as they wanted to be. Because in about 15 minutes, every one of them was going to need to remember that I'd been gracious, that I'd been calm, that I'd poured the coffee and welcomed them in. The contrast was going to matter more than anything I could say. Carol was mid-sentence about her tomato plants when we all heard it. A big engine dropping gears, then the long crunch of tires swinging off the sandy lane onto my gravel. Through the front window, a white moving truck edged into view, way too big for my little drive, and behind it my father's old sedan. My relatives turned to me, delighted. I set my mug down and said, right on time. I want to describe how they climbed out of that truck, because it tells you everything about what my mother believed was happening. The passenger door swung open first, and she stepped down like a woman arriving at a property she already held the keys to. She dressed for it. Pressed slacks, the good earrings, her hair set. She looked over the cottage, the water, the porch, and gave a small, satisfied nod, the nod of somebody confirming that a thing she'd been promised had shown up on schedule. My father got out of the sedan slowly, and he didn't look at the house at all. He looked at his shoes, at the gravel, at the sky, anywhere but the front door. And I knew that my phone call the night before had finally flipped a switch in that dark room, and now he couldn't unsee whatever was in it. Then Brandon dropped out of the truck cab, stretched, and heaved open the back to show it packed floor to ceiling with their whole lives. Boxes labeled in my mother's handwriting. Kitchen. Linens, Gary's office. A recliner. A headboard. The guts of a sold house, every last piece of it wagered on the bet that I'd fold. My mother started up the walk with her arms already opening, and then her eyes landed on the porch and her stride hitched, because the porch wasn't empty. Her sister was standing on it holding a coffee cake. Her nieces were behind her with a bag of oranges and bright, puzzled faces. And I was in the doorway of my own house, calm as a Sunday morning, holding a mug. For half a step, my mother hesitated. I watched her run the numbers, watched her decide the crowd was a gift, an audience to perform her grand arrival for. She snapped the smile back into place and came up the steps. Well, she announced to everybody we made it. Then my mother handed the whole thing to me herself. She walked into my living room like a tour guide and put on a show. "Oh, it's smaller than the photos," she said, dragging a finger along my windowsill, "but we'll make it work. Gary, the back room gets the morning light, that's ours." She turned to Carol and beamed. "We've been planning this for months, haven't we, Rachel? It just makes sense, family all in one place." She told Megan that Brandon could take the second bedroom until he got sorted out. She told Lauren she was thinking of repainting the yellow cabinets, something more neutral. She stood in the middle of the house I'd bought with 11 years of overnight shifts and started giving its rooms away one by one to an audience she trusted to be charmed. And the entire time I just watched and let her go, because every word out of her mouth was a brick I wouldn't have to lay myself. Carol's smile had gone stiff. She kept sneaking looks at me, waiting for me to jump in, to laugh and agree the way I always did. I didn't. I stayed by the kitchen drawer with my coffee and let the quiet stack up. My mother didn't notice it. She'd never once had to notice my silence because I'd always rushed to fill it for her. She kept rolling, planning Thanksgiving in my dining room, telling Lauren which church she'd already picked. And the longer she talked, the wider the gap grew between her story and the calm, unbothered woman standing in the doorway of a house that plainly already belonged to somebody. Finally, she clapped her hands together, bright and businesslike. "All right," she said, "Brandon, start with the kitchen boxes." "Rachel, honey, where do you want our things?" The whole room turned to look at me. I set down my mug. "Before we move anything," I said, "I want to make sure everybody in here is working off the same facts because I think there's been some confusion." My voice was easy, conversational, the same one I'd used 100 times to tell a family their person was stable. My mother's smile pulled tight. "Rachel, this isn't the time." "Mom," I said gently, "tell everyone again. The way you told them before. What exactly did I agree to?" She blinked. "We discussed it. You wanted us close." When I asked, "When did we discuss it?" "Months ago," she said, but her eyes darted to Carol, checking the room. "I closed on this house 4 weeks ago," I said. "I moved in the day before yesterday." "So what month did I offer it to you?" The pause that came next was the first genuine silence my mother had ever lost in front of an audience. Carol shifted on her feet. Megan frowned and glanced down at her phone, at something, maybe running the same math I had. "You sent me the listing," my mother said, recovering fast, pivoting. "You wanted to show me." "I sent the listing to Dad," I said, "one person. The night I got the keys because I was proud of it." I turned to my aunt and kept my voice warm because none of this was her fault. "Carol, when Mom told you I'd offered up the house, did I ever even once say that to you myself?" Carol's mouth opened and closed. "Well," she said slowly. "No, your mother told us." "I know what my mother told you," I said, still gentle. "I just need everyone clear that it never came from me." The room had gone dead still. The good chairs and the coffee cake and the little oranges all forgot. My mother's face had begun to shift, the performance splitting at the seams. That's when I opened the kitchen drawer. I took out the manila folder, set it on the dining table where everybody could see, and laid it open flat. 2 pages. I never once raised my voice. "This is the deed to this house," I said, turning it so Carol and the cousins could read. "There's one name on it. Mine. Not Mom's, not Dad's, not the family's. Mine." I set the second page down beside it. "And this is a letter from the attorney who handled the closing. It says the same thing. The house belongs to me, and nobody else has any claim on it." I looked at my mother and kept my tone as flat and calm as the water outside. "A promise made at a dinner table isn't a deed, Mom. You can tell people I offered. You can believe it yourself. It doesn't budge a single brick of this house out of my name." For one heartbeat, nobody breathed. Then my mother went off. "After everything we did for you," she said, her voice climbing and cracking, "you'd throw your own parents out on the street in front of family. I raised you. I gave up everything, and you stand there waving a piece of paper." She was loud now, loud enough that Lauren flinched, her face going red and wet, the pressed slacks and the set hair all forgotten. "We sold our house, Rachel. We have nowhere to go. Is that what you want? To humiliate us? To toss us out like trash?" She wanted me to match her. To get loud, to turn into the unstable, ungrateful daughter her story needed me to be. I didn't. I stood there with my hands folded and let her storm break against the quiet. And the more still I stayed, the louder and smaller she got, until the only person putting on a show in that room was her. And the audience she'd assembled to shame me was watching her instead. "You didn't sell your house because of me," I said when she finally stopped to catch her breath. "You sold it before you ever asked me. That's the difference. And everybody in this room can see it now." My mother stared at me, chest heaving, and asked the one question she'd never in her whole life had to put to me directly. "So what are we supposed to do now?" The whole room waited, and I gave her the only answer that fit. The exact words she'd handed me over the phone 2 nights before, in the same even tone she'd used, returned to her precisely as they'd left her. "If you don't like it," I said, "you can find somewhere else." The silence after that was complete. Carol set her coffee cake down on the table like it had suddenly gotten heavy. Brandon, who'd been hanging in the doorway with a box marked kitchen in his arms, slowly bent down, set it on the floor, and didn't pick up another one. My father had lowered himself into one of Carol's folding chairs without anyone noticing, hands dangling between his knees. My mother swept the room looking for her allies, the crowd she'd built, the chorus that always did her pushing, and one by one they wouldn't meet her eyes. Megan was reading her phone, the screenshot of the listing, the dates. Lauren was staring at the floor. Carol was looking at her sister with a face I'd never seen her turn on my mother before. Not anger. Something worse for my mother than anger. Doubt. The audience had finally heard the other side, in the same room at the same hour. And the weapon my mother had spent 3 weeks loading had just gone off in her own hands. I'd be lying if I told you I felt nothing but victory, and you've trusted me this far, so I won't start lying now. When my mother realized the room had turned, the fury drained out of her all at once, and what was left underneath was the thing she'd been hiding behind the whole performance. Fear. Ordinary human fear. She was 63. The house she'd raised us in was sold. The money my father had sworn he'd handle was gone, and she'd just been seen completely by every relative whose respect she'd spent a lifetime managing. For one moment, she didn't look like my opponent. She looked like a scared woman who'd made a terrible bet and lost it in front of everyone she knew. And some part of me, the part that spent 11 years holding the hands of frightened people, ached for her. I'll be honest that the ache was real. I'll also be honest that it didn't change what I did. And that's the part it took me 35 years to figure out. You can feel for someone and still not hand them your house. You can be sorry that someone is afraid and still refuse to make their fear your job. I felt sorry for my mother that morning. I just finally stopped feeling responsible for her. Those are 2 separate things, and it took me my whole life to tell them apart. They didn't move in. There was nothing left to fight over once the deed was on the table and the room had gone quiet. Brandon carried the kitchen box back out to the truck, and the rest of their lives rode back up the coast that afternoon, later unloaded into a storage unit my mother could afford even less than her pride. Carol stayed after they left. She sat with me on the silver porch and apologized. Really apologized, her hands shaking around her mug. She told me you'd offered, Carol kept saying. I never thought to ask you myself. I should have asked. I told her it wasn't her fault, and I meant it. That was how the whole thing worked. It only needed people who loved my mother enough to believe her without ever checking. My parents rented a 2-bedroom apartment near their old neighborhood within the month. The kind of modest place they could have picked from the start, the kind that didn't require anybody's house, just their own choices. Brandon, with the basement no longer a guarantee, went out and found a job. Not a great one, a job. And the family group chat, the one that had filled up with all those cheerful messages about my generosity, went dead quiet for a while, then slowly came back as something more honest. A place where, for the first time, people asked how I was doing instead of telling me what I'd already agreed to. I didn't cut my parents off. People expect that to be the ending, the clean break, the door slammed for good. It wasn't. A week later, I emailed my mother a list of senior apartments in their county. 3 of them with phone numbers all inside their budget. That was it. Not money, not my front door. A list and some phone numbers. The help I was willing to give freely on my own terms instead of the help that gets taken from you and then called your duty. She never thanked me for it. But my father called a few weeks later just to talk, and at the end he said, quiet as ever, I'm glad you kept your house, Rachel. It was the closest he could get to saying the rest of it, and I took it. I see them now and then. On my terms, at my pace, with the truth finally sitting in the room with us instead of a story getting told behind my back. It's not the family I dreamed about as a girl, but it's an honest one, and it's the first one I've ever been able to rest inside.